Okay, I am hoping that this is going to work better. Unfortunately, there's been a big catastrophe with trying to set up this call. YouTube changed their settings in the background. I haven't done one of these live webinars in over a year, and I guess I wasn't aware of how they changed their settings until I started to try to record this. So I think there's a little bit of a Murphy's Law situation going on. If you are listening and you can hear me, please write in the chat because I want to verify that it's working. I'm going to try to quickly, while I'm also doing this, post links to the actual talk. And if you are watching this as a recording, then again, sorry for all these difficulties. Live stuff, it just seems to be like just the law of nature that when you do something live, it just doesn't work. So I'm going to just quickly post the actual link on the 3 other videos that I've made that have been about this. And hopefully you guys can forgive my inadequacy in using YouTube for live streaming right now. So let me go here and find the link. You know, I think this is still the old one. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to just message one of my colleagues here to send the link. Okay, so unfortunately, one of the issues is that I do have a good mic, but for some reason, YouTube doesn't want to let me use my good mic, and the AirPods I have are actually dying. I was supposed to be using them just as a backup, but if they die, I'm hoping I'm going to be able to switch my audio here with just one of the other ones here. Doesn't look like it. Oh. It doesn't look like it's going to let me do that either. Well, hopefully it will last then. I'm just going to have to go for it. So as with the chat before, you can write questions in there. Let me know that you're still hearing me. And hopefully we'll be able to edit this into something that's listenable at the end. So why did I want to do this chat? Well, it's nice to talk to people and nice to talk to the readers in this kind of setting if we can get over the technical difficulties. And I just spent the last couple of months doing a lot of research for this complete guide to motivation, as this has been something that's been on my mind. And I think it's a topic that a lot of people care about. A lot of people care about how do you motivate yourself to do hard things? How do you motivate yourself to study? And I wanted to dig into it a little bit, get into some of the research to not only for my own understanding, but also so that when I give advice to people on what to do to motivate themselves, I have that kind of background to understand it. Now, I do think that motivation can be a somewhat mysterious subject. It can be something that it feels like, you know, you're either motivated or you're not. But I think there's a real benefit to thinking of motivation as a system. And what I mean by that is that when you see your motivation as a system, you start to think about how there's different inputs that could go into your motivation and how you can organize those inputs to create a system for your life so that you can have the motivation to do the things that you want to do. And so one of the things that I wanted to do in this was not just to try to answer kind of practical questions like, you know, how do I motivate myself or how do I stop procrastination? Not that those aren't important, but to try to see, is there a system we can understand? Can we understand what are like the basic ingredients for why we're motivated, why we're not motivated, why we have sort of struggles to do things? And if we understand that system, then it's a lot easier to kind of diagnose problems. And so I do think there's a lot of open questions about motivation. I covered a lot of the research, and you can see it hasn't really cohered into something where, okay, this is the system for motivation that everyone agrees on. But there's a lot of stuff that we do know about motivation, a lot of similarities among different theories and different systems. So if you understand kind of the basic idea of motivation, then I think it's something that you can do quite easily. So I think there's a few key elements to the system for motivation that you want to think about when you're thinking about your own motivation. One of those is the idea of reinforcement. So reinforcement is going back to the earlier behaviorist days, it is the idea that what gets rewarded gets reinforced and is the thing that you are more likely to be motivated for. So if you experience rewards or you experience some kind of positive feedback from the things that you engage in, then you naturally like doing those things more and you have more incentive for doing them. And similarly, if you feel punishment or you get some kind of negative experience from doing something, it becomes harder to do that thing. And so this is at the core of a lot of motivational systems. A lot of motivational systems have this sort of dual property where if you are rewarded to do it, you will be more likely to do it in the future. If you are punished for doing it, you'll find it harder to do. And I think there's a lot of complexities there. So there's obviously people who manage to do things that aren't always pleasant. And there are people who struggle to do things that are fairly pleasant. But I think if we keep this reinforcement idea as a central component of our system, we can look at a lot of the motivational problems we see as some kind of reinforcement problem. The reason maybe you don't like studying is because it has this association with sort of negative experiences. Or the reason that maybe you like playing a certain sport is because you got reinforced for doing it. You felt that you were good at it. You felt like you got social approval, or maybe you even felt like you got some intrinsic enjoyment out of it. So reinforcement, I think, is the kind of core of the system. The other idea of the system is expectation and value. So expectation is the idea that this is a theory that I talk about in the complete guide from Lewis and Tolman. And this is this idea that we make our motivational choices about what we want to pursue based on how much we value things. And this goes back to the idea of reinforcement. So value sort of comes from this reinforcement idea. It's the things that you think you'll get rewarded for, you'll get something pleasurable out of. And then expectation is sort of how likely do we think that we'll get that. So if something is very, very likely and it has very, very high value, we have a lot of motivation. If something has a lot of value, but really low probability, well, maybe we're not that motivated. Maybe, me winning an Academy Award, maybe I would have a lot of value for that, but I'm not even an actor. So my expectation for getting that is going to be pretty, pretty low. Similarly, I think that if you have a lot of expectation for something, but the value isn't that high, then your motivation is not that. It's just not that important to you. So if you think, like I could probably do this, but I don't really care about it, then your motivation is low. So this is a kind of cognitive theory. And the reinforcement idea is more of a mechanical theory. The reinforcement idea is just that, when you experience rewards, you'll just do more of that thing. When you experience punishment, you'll just do less of that thing. Whereas the expectation and value idea is that you are imagining something. You're imagining some object of your desire, and you're asking yourself, probably subconsciously, how much do I value this? How much am I drawn to it? And, if I work at it, what's the likelihood that I will actually achieve it? And I think, again, talking about reinforcement, giving you some idea of like, why don't you like studying, or why do you struggle to go to the gym? Because there's some kind of maybe inherent effort or strain or unpleasantness, and maybe the reward is somewhat far away. Similarly, I think that with the expectation value, you can look at things like, what's your level of confidence? So you might think, oh, it'd be really great to get A's on my exam, but if I don't have much confidence that I'll be able to do it, then that also maybe reduces my inclination to study. If I think, well, if I study, it doesn't matter, I'm not going to be able to achieve it anyways, then your motivation goes down. So these are sort of two very common components to this system. Another feature of the motivational system that I found that was recurring was the idea that a lot of our motivational calculations are opaque, or they're unconscious, or they're things that we don't really have introspective ability. And so this means diagnosing your own motivational problems can be kind of hard, because when you think about your motivation, what you're dealing with is just a feeling. You just have this feeling of, I just feel myself being drawn to do certain things, or I find a lot of resistance in doing other things. And this is a kind of a higher level idea. So you don't really know whether, okay, I'm feeling like I don't have a lot of desire to study right now because there was not enough reward, like I don't feel like there's enough reinforcement to the studying, or because maybe there's some kind of aversive quality. So like I really dislike the studying, and so that's making it unpleasant for me. Or I don't know whether it's, I don't assign enough value to doing well on this exam, or whether it's that, I don't have a high expectation that my efforts will yield results. So I don't see the purpose in it. And I think you can kind of introspect this a little bit. But it's certainly not the case that, there's a little dashboard that you can pull up and you'd be like, nah, right, this is the problem. I have too much punishment or too much aversion. I have not enough reinforcement, and that's why I'm having this motivational problem. So I think the fact that we all experience motivation at this level, that it's just this experience of wanting to do things, wanting to move forward to things, but we don't always know why, I think doubly makes the system idea of motivation very important, because it gives you some kind of starting point for thinking about why you might not be motivated to do some of the things that you want to do. Another element of this system is feedback. So there were a couple different theories that all exhibited positive feedback in the research I encountered. So one of the more prominent ones of these is Albert Bandura's self-efficacy theory. And so self-efficacy basically states that in addition to your expectation of achieving a result, you have to believe that you can do something, you can actually go out and do it, or you probably won't have a lot of motivation to do it. So if I don't think that I can learn a language, let's say, I'm not going to have a lot of motivation to try to learn a language. It's going to be very difficult for me to go forward with it. And the problem with self-efficacy is that it can become a positive feedback loop. So if you think you might be able to do something, then you go out and you gain the experience of actually doing it, which of course makes you more and more certain that you can do it, and it creates a positive feedback cycle. Conversely, if you feel like you can't do it, you lack the motivation to often do the things that would make it easier to do. So that's one of the theories that had some elements of positive feedback. Another theory that had positive feedback was Robert Eisenberg's learned industriousness. And his theory was basically that the reason that we sometimes will work harder on certain goals is because if you work hard on things, then when you strive, when you sort of exert effort, and then you later get rewarded, the feeling of striving, the feeling of putting effort in itself gets a bit rewarded. And so the basic theories of motivation assume that people don't want to strive. They don't want to put in effort. They want to do something easier if possible. And I think that's probably largely true. However, if you do a lot of things that are kind of high reward, high striving, then the striving itself gets easier. And so this, again, is a kind of positive feedback system where you can imagine yourself going down two different paths. One is where you kind of choose low effort, but kind of low reward opportunities, like, just like play video games today or just check on my phone. And then on the other hand, you might choose a kind of higher reward, higher difficulty. So like, I'm going to really get in shape. Well, that's maybe a really high reward. Maybe you really value that, but at the same time, it's a lot of effort. You have to go to the gym and work out a lot. And so this idea that there is a kind of shift in how effortful and ambitious your goals are based not only on self-efficacy, but on how difficult it is for you to put in effort itself, and that this is informed by feedback, is very interesting, because any kind of positive feedback system suggests that if you could nudge yourself onto the different track, then it would become easier and easier. Conversely, if you were stuck, then that would be a major problem of like, how do you get motivation when you're finding it very difficult to do? So to reiterate some of these ideas of the system: reinforcement, that we are driven to things that we've been rewarded for in the past, and we avoid things that we've been kind of punished for or had unpleasant experiences for in the past. Expectation value is that we're motivated to pursue things that we value high, but also things that we think that we can actually achieve. So if our expectation is low, we're unlikely to pursue those goals, even if we would value it if we got it. Thirdly, that we often experience motivation in an unconscious way. So we don't actually have always a clear sense of why we feel motivated or why we don't feel motivated. We just have the raw feeling. And that this is an important reason to actually kind of understand the system of motivation, because we don't have this dashboard giving us this idea. And also the idea of feedback, which is that there are many theories of motivation that suggest there's a positive feedback loop. That is, you strive harder and you work on harder goals, you find yourself more motivated. And I think this fits into a lot of the advice that many people give on letting motivation follow behavior, meaning doing something that you don't feel that motivated to do, you're just barely motivated to do it. But as you do it more and more and you get this positive feedback, it will become easier and easier. So unfortunately, this talk has been a little bit tricky just because of the multiple video changes and all of this kind of stuff. So I'm a little bit behind the schedule I wanted to do. Now, I have talked a little bit about motivation here, and I highly recommend checking out the complete guide to motivation, where I talk about it in a lot more detail. But now I'm going to turn to some questions, because I know many of you had questions that you wanted to ask me in doing this live chat. So let me go back to start here to see who had some questions here. So one person is asking, how does intelligence affect motivation? And I didn't read any research that made a direct link that like more intelligent people are more motivated, but you could see it being intermediated through this kind of concept of self-efficacy or expectancy. So for the tasks that require intelligence, let's say you want to get a PhD in physics, and you feel like you're really, really smart, you're a genius, your expectation of achieving that goal is going to be higher. And so you're probably also going to be more motivated. So to the extent that intelligence probably makes a difference in your success on various tasks, it probably makes you more motivated as well. However, I don't think that it's a clear-cut, more intelligent means more motivated all the time, too, because I think that there's often the case where you are very smart, but you have also a lot of maybe negative experiences doing things. You can get into this cycle where you are not able to get over it. And I think the idea here is that motivation isn't something that you necessarily think your way out of, that if you're just really, really smart, you can just solve this problem of motivation, because it is an affective thing. It is a feeling. And so I think there definitely are people who are quite intelligent, but they don't have good control over their motivations, or they don't have a good control over these kinds of systems. And so I've definitely seen people who are quite smart that just kind of circle around because of that problem. Long-term intrinsic motivation. So I think that the idea I talked about with motivation as a system suggests to me that there's a lot of kind of common motivational problems that are across all sorts of different goals. So one of them, which I didn't get a chance to mention in my brief mini talk, but is this idea of temporal motivation theory, which is that we tend to discount future events pretty steeply. So if you have some choice between something that's immediately rewarding, something that you value it even higher, but it's not good for months from now, the tendency is obviously to procrastinate. That it's hard to do this thing that even if you really value it, it's kind of in the future. And one of the solutions to stick to that consistently, then you're taking this sort of long-term ambition, bringing it up to the present and making it something that, okay, well, I might be able to convince myself that I can work towards this goal in a month or two, but I can't tell myself that, okay, I can just procrastinate all day. Today, I have to actually work on it. And so I think that's one of the things that having a system can be beneficial for, having a productivity system, is that any goal you fit into is going to have this problem of the benefits are far away and the kind of costs or the opportunity costs of doing it are here and now. And so this is one of the things that I think having a system, having some kind of productivity system, having a system for your goals, having personal rules about how many projects you should have, how you should commit to the project, like when you give up. I think that's why these things are important. So one person is asking about perfectionism. And I don't know as much about obsessive compulsive disorder in the motivational picture, but perfectionism, it was interesting because this is often one of these purported causes of procrastination. And Pierce Steele did a big meta-study, more just the unpleasantness of the task. And so I think perfectionism can kind of go both ways. That perfectionism can hold you back. Perfectionism, especially if you don't think that you can attain it, I think can be damaging because of this whole self-efficacy concept, that if I don't think I can reach the level that I've set, I may just not approach a task because I'm kind of, essentially perfectionism is saying it's either, to be valuable, it has to be perfect or it's not valuable at all. And so that might, make me less motivated to do those things if I don't think I can attain that. On the other hand, if you think you can attain it, then perfectionism may actually push you to work harder on a goal. Is your problem that you're being a perfectionist, or is the problem your goal? So maybe the problem isn't that you're being too much of a perfectionist, but that you don't feel like you can reach the standards that you want. Feel like you can reach the standards that you want to reach, which might. I'm cutting out apparently. Do we have? So Nez is asking how self-esteem can affect motivation. So I mentioned this self-efficacy concept, and that seems to be related to self-esteem, but I think they're somewhat different. So self-efficacy is more about the pursuit. So I might be really self-efficacious in something that I'm good at. So I might feel a lot of self-efficacy in the articles I write. I personally right now feel a lack of self-efficacy in my live streaming technical ability, as this live stream has been plagued with technical issues that I've not had before. But that shows that these are different. So it's not about my self-worth as a person, but it's about, do I think I can accomplish this specific thing? And I think there are people that have low self-esteem that are highly self-efficacious. So they are people that maybe kind of have a negative self-view, so they don't feel that they're worth that much. They feel like they're a loser. But if you give them a list of concrete tasks, they're like, oh yeah, I can do that, I can do that, I can do that. And so I think they are somewhat different. I do think self-esteem might affect the goals that you set or how you think of yourself. Certainly having no self-esteem is not great for motivation. At the same time, I think having maybe really, really inflated self-esteem, so kind of thinking that you are the center of the universe and you're all important, everything ought to bend to your will, is also probably not great either. So I think it's important to separate those ideas. So self-efficacy is probably related to self-esteem. If you have really low self-efficacy, I could imagine that going into self-esteem. But I also think that it's probably the case that self-efficacy is quite specific. And so you can have things that you feel efficacious about and things that you don't. So one person is asking, do I have any advice on juggling multiple projects productively? So I think that juggling is, I think that every single project that you have to do that's effortful has a sort of, let's say, overhead. And this mental overhead of like how much you need to keep it in mind in order to do it. So if I decided my goal right now is exercise, then yes, I need to show up to the gym and exercise and that kind of thing. But I also need to kind of keep it at the forefront of my priorities in my life. So when there's a conflict, telling myself, yeah, but my project right now is exercising, so I have to go to the gym. If I'm working on a learning project, I have to kind of make that the priority. And I think when you have multiple projects that are going on simultaneously, this is hard to do because you frequently get into these conflicts where, you don't have enough time for both of them. So which one do you work on and where do you go for things? So I think to the extent that it's possible, having a single kind of project where it's like occupying a lot of your attention is important. Now, I tend to distinguish projects from habits in this way. So if I'm kind of already exercising every day and I'm not really trying to, do something far and beyond what I normally do when I go to the gym, then that might be a habit for me and I don't really need to think about it. Whereas if I'm trying to do something that's not part of my daily routine, that's what I consider a project. And I try to have as few of those as possible. I think it is possible sometimes to have different ones for different domains of your life. So you can have like a work one in your personal life that are different. But the more projects you have, certainly the more personal projects you have, I just think it's a lot harder to organize. So this is even for me, I just find that I achieve far fewer goals when I have multiple projects. And so let's see the comments here we have. So someone was asking me about the relationship between age and motivation. I do this kind of theory of motivation is happening through different phases. So there's the part of choosing the goal, the part of planning for the goal, and the part of striving for the goal. And what he finds is that in the goal choice, we tend to benefit from a little bit of impulsiveness. If you're the kind of like, all right, let's do it kind of attitude, then maybe you'll choose more goals. But that impulsiveness tends to work less well when you're actually striving towards a goal. So I think this kind of matches my own feeling, is that when you're younger, maybe you have more enthusiasm and more ideas. You have that kind of raw, ideational, motivational energy. But maybe you have a harder time sticking to things, that it's harder for you to stick to a goal for a long period of time. And I think also, as your life stage changes, you also have different kind of costs and benefits when it comes to goals. So I think that, if you are 20 and you have lots of free time and you have a lot of ambitions and you want to really work at it, then that's great. But when you maybe are 40 and you have kids and you're kind of stable with what's happened in your life, maybe you don't see the value of having really, really big ambitions, but you do see the cost. Whereas when you're 20, you see more of the value, and the costs are things you can easily absorb. So I think that how your motivation changes in your life, I think also changes based on what you value and what your kind of lifestyle situation permits. So someone's asking me about motivational speakers. What is it about a motivational speech that truly helps? So this is a personal opinion. This isn't based on any kind of research or anything, but I do like motivational speaking. I think I liked it more when I was younger, and kind of a lot of the concepts around self-improvement were newer to me. Nowadays, I kind of feel like I'd rather read like sort of deeper research on psychology, on some aspect of motivation, even if it's a little drier, just because it might give new ideas. And so for me, I think what makes a speech motivational is twofold. I think one, it should expose you to new information. And sometimes that new information is just an example. So, I mean, when I wrote my book, I made a big point of putting in a lot of examples, because I feel like, yeah, you can talk about the abstract principles of how to learn more effectively, but people are motivated when they see, this is a concrete example of what I would like to be like, or what I would like to do. And so I think good motivational speakers are often good storytellers. They're good at taking examples of people. The second thing that I think is helpful for motivation is, or for motivational speaking or motivational writing, I think, is to have kind of like a show, don't tell sort of attitude with it, that if what you're saying isn't motivating, then just like saying it louder and more with more excitement, I don't think really works. So I feel like the way that you should motivate, or at least my personal philosophy on that, is that the idea should just be automatically motivating. That when you understand this idea, you should be like, oh, look at all these opportunities or possibilities for my life, as opposed to, I'm going to take kind of a bland idea and try to, get you really, really amped up about it. But that's just me. I know some people often really resonate with, I would say, more emotive speakers who focus more on kind of the emotional part of it rather than the informational content. So Sir No Name is asking what I think about Jocko Willink, and he says, don't count on motivation, count on discipline, because motivation is only temporary. So I want to be clear here, because one of the problems is that when you talk about ideas in a kind of popular context, so if you're reading a self-improvement book or something, they'll often use words in a fairly specific way. So classic example of that is learning. I've often dealt with this idea that when you talk about learning, people think of like schools and reading books and taking classes and stuff, and they don't think about like forming new habits is a kind of learning. But to a psychologist, forming a new kind of habit is itself a kind of learning. It's the same sort of fundamental process. And so I think when we look at motivation from the kind of psychological lens, the science of motivation lens we're looking at, then both willpower and kind of your sort of spontaneous, I just want to do this kind of motivation, are both sort of types of motivation. They're both elements of this motivational system. So I think what Jocko is kind of talking about is, don't rely on feeling like you want to do something in order to do it, that you should have some top-down control. You should have some sense of, all right, but I don't want to go to the gym, but my kind of system that I'm operating in tells me that I have to. And so there would be a pain for me to violate my own system. And so I'm going to go through with this because I'm a disciplined person. And I really agree with that. I think that it's very difficult to just rely on the spontaneous flow of things that you're naturally inclined to do, and that it's helpful to have structures around your life that provide this kind of top-down control, so that, maybe I don't feel motivated to write an article this week, but I write an article every week, and I would feel bad if I didn't do that. So I'm going to write an article regardless. And so I think that that's very important. That being said, though, I think that the thing that's often missing is that if the path that you're going forward involves a lot of resistance, a lot of pain, a lot of difficulty, then it's going to be slow going. So you might have willpower, you might be able to stick to it, but if you really don't like doing it, it's going to be hard to do in the long term. So I think what we're looking for in the long term is not only to have discipline and willpower, and that's definitely necessary, but also to have the activities that we do on a regular basis that we need to do to achieve our goal shouldn't be super, super unpleasant. And there's going to be unpleasant parts. There's going to be things that we don't like doing. But at the same time, to use my own example, I had to use a lot of willpower doing the MIT challenge. But if I hated studying for it, there's no way I would have gotten it done. I genuinely like doing it. It's just sometimes it was more effort than watching TV. And so I did need a bit of willpower. But when I started doing it, okay, this is fun. I find these classes interesting. I like doing this. So I think that's very important, is that you kind of want both of those things. If, for instance, you really, 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 really hate your workout routine, probably going to get more benefit from changing your workout routine than just forcing yourself to be more disciplined all the time. And I think there's sometimes a trade-off. Which one matters more? Do you need more willpower? Do you need to make the activity itself more intrinsically enjoyable? But I think they probably are both and not one or the other. So Chris is talking about, what about when the task looks easy? So you have high self-efficacy at first, but it's actually much more difficult than expected. So how does that work? And this is actually really interesting. As I mentioned before, Piers Steele has this sort of three-stage idea of motivation, where what happens when you're choosing a goal, planning the goal, and striving for the goal is a little different. So maybe impulsiveness helps you in picking goals, but it hurts you in actually striving for the goals because you're more likely to get distracted and do something else. And in this way, your expectation of success actually influences these planning phases. So having a high expectancy encourages you to choose the goal, but it also discourages you from doing proper planning. And again, if you have sort of the reality is different from your expectation, it may discourage you from striving, because when you start striving, you say to yourself, oh, wow, this is way harder than I thought it was going to be. So maybe I don't want to pursue this goal. So I think that it often actually makes sense to have a kind of almost schizophrenic approach, that when you are picking goals, you're a little bit overly ambitious and confident. But then when you're planning goals, you're like the ultimate pessimist. So when you pick the goal, you should be, yeah, okay, I don't know how to do that, but maybe let's do that. But when you're planning the goal, you should be like, okay, everything that could go wrong will go wrong. Everything's going to take much longer than I think. It's going to be much harder than I think it's going to be. And if you can kind of balance that tension, I think that you end up not only picking more valuable goals, but you're much more prepared for handling them. And I think this kind of meta quality of being a really careful planner and really diligent striver with a kind of somewhat ambitious chooser of goals, I think is something that can get reinforced. So I found that in my own life, that as I've sort of picked more ambitious goals and then sort of taken them very seriously when I'm working on them, but then managed to get to the end of them, this kind of gives me confidence in this overall system. Not just a general sense that everything will be easy for me, but this kind of reinforced belief that I have the capacity to put in a lot of effort on something that might be different or difficult. So XL is asking, how do we motivate ourselves to be digitally minimalist while the external world may reinforce us to multitasking? So this is actually a really good question, and I'm going to take it a little broader than just about the issue of digital minimalism here. I think that one of the challenges of pursuing any kind of lifestyle change that you want to make, or any kind of habit or any kind of goal, is that there's often a much easier default activity. So one kind of way of viewing this idea of reinforcement and motivation is the idea that your behavior kind of flows downhill. So if you imagine sort of all the options of things you could do being the kind of area around you, then if you think of yourself as just sort of naturally rolling wherever it's steepest, and that defining the choices that you make, then this, I think, explains a lot about our behavior. And so I think the problem with distracting digital devices, let's say, is that they are kind of easier to do. They cause you to roll down the hill. So if you're choosing between, watching a difficult lecture and, watching a funny YouTube video, you're going to kind of drift towards this one. Now, I think there's some ways you can kind of tip the scales. So your attention is one way you can tip the scales. So sort of momentarily, you can say to yourself, no, this is what's important to me, and you can do this. But I think once your attention slips, it tends to reassert itself. Another thing you can do is have this kind of system. So I think if you want to be digitally minimalist, for instance, I think you need to have blocks and restrictions on your devices, at least while those behavior patterns of checking your phone all the time, for instance, are fairly automatic. Because if you have a fence that keeps you from rolling down the hill in the most obvious way, then you can sort of glide along towards the behavior you want to set. And I think in the positive sense, you want to do that as well, that you want to kind of corral your motivation so that the other things that are more tempting just aren't options for you. Now, there's a bit of a bootstrapping problem here, because obviously setting up these fences and actually enforcing them is itself a kind of motivational commitment. So there's this kind of catch-22 problem where if you don't have the motivation to avoid using Facebook, then you maybe also don't have the motivation to set up barriers for yourself. But I think it can be overcome, because setting up the barriers and creating fences and corralling your motivation and planning out your goals and creating systems and this kind of thing, that it tends to be a one-time investment of effort. Whereas doing something that you have to do all the time requires that you have to keep that goal, keep that commitment in mind every single time you're tempted, and that is much more likely to fail in the long run. So let's look at some of these other ones. What, if anything, is different in approaching motivation for daily tasks and longer-term project-oriented motivation? So I think they're both relevant here. So the daily tasks level, I think one of the major challenges here is that if the task that you have to do isn't particularly urgent, doesn't need to be done right now, and you're not going to have any negative consequences for not doing it, there's almost always going to be some other alternative that's just easier or more spontaneously enjoyable. And so the key is that you want some kind of system that keeps you from doing that. So this is why I'm a big fan of productivity systems. I'm a big fan of having these kind of structures for your daily life, because that changes the equation. So the equation when you don't have any system is, do I choose studying or do I choose watching television? And if there's no real logic of why you should do one or the other, then as long as the studying isn't particularly urgent or compelling, it's going to be easier to watch television. However, if you have some kind of system in place, this is, well, I have to study 1 hour every single day, hypothetically, and whether you've done it or not. And so now the question is, do I violate my system or do I watch television? And it may be the case, if you've reinforced this system for enough time, you've been doing it for months and months and months, and you trust that system, that you now think of yourself as well, I really don't want to violate my system. So I think this is why creating kind of rules and fences and kind of structures for your motivation can be helpful, because it trades the sort of one time doing this task that maybe doesn't really matter in the long run if you skipped it, versus breaking my system. And if I break my system, then I'm going to maybe experience some pain. And I think that is something that can be helpful. And when it comes to longer term motivation, I think that longer term goals are often more compelling. We have a higher value for them. But because they're so far away, they often don't inspire concrete action. So to me, they're just kind of different phases. Your long-term goals have to get translated into some kind of daily task level, or you're not actually working on them. And so part of your system should be taking those really big, high value things that, that would be really good if I did that, but it's going to take a year, and translating that to, okay, well, I have to work on this task today then if I'm actually going to stay on track for doing that. So having this system, I think, is really important. So Eva's asking, how do I suggest these ideas to teenagers? So this is actually kind of interesting because one of the ideas that I mentioned is that impulse control is really important for procrastination and is really important for motivation, because you can think about it this way. What impulse control is that you have a kind of downhill gradient to like watch the television. And from the top down, you can say to yourself, no, 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 my goals are more important. So I can kind of tilt the playing surface so I can roll down towards actually studying or doing something important. Now, it turns out that the impulse control heavily depends on the prefrontal cortex. That's kind of the part of the brain that's up here. And this is underdeveloped in teenagers. It's something that they will get better at as they get older, but it's something that they have a harder time when they're younger. So younger people tend to be more impulsive. They tend to not think about the long-term consequences of their actions. They tend to be lazier in this way because, again, the problem is always a decision between doing something hard now and doing something difficult later. So I think my first sort of suggestion would just be to be kind to teenagers, is understanding that this is a faculty that is still developing for them. So just because they're lazy when they're 15 doesn't mean that they'll be lazy when they're 25 or 35. And at the same time, creating structures for them. So if they don't have the motivation to create those structures, then, sitting down and talking to them, okay, well, we want to be able to do this. What would be a good system for this? And how can we monitor and enforce this system for studying? I think sometimes there's an expectation that we want our children to be better than we are too. So I think having that kindness, not only towards ourselves, but towards our children is very important, because, I've met many people who, like, they watch television, but they don't want their kids to watch television. And there's a conflict there. And so similarly, if, you are trying to enforce more discipline and more effort, more studying on your children than you would enforce on yourself, it can be hard. It can be hard to do that. And so I think talking to them, trying to work on creating systems to structure their motivation, but being compassionate and understanding that, this is a faculty that takes longer to develop. So let us go to another question here. What do I think about dopamine detoxes to get better contrast for hard things? So I don't know. The word dopamine detox to me just sounds kind of wrong, I guess. I kind of feel like I know what it's implying, but I mean, it's not like you're not giving yourself dopamine or something like that. Dopamine is required for signaling in all parts of your brain. I think that the idea that I would focus on is not so much a detox, because I think the problem with a detox is that you temporarily remove everything, and maybe you even start to readjust to a kind of new, more minimalist habit baseline. That's good. But then you go back to doing your normal things and expect that it's going to carry over. And I think that there's probably pretty quick relapse. I think this is probably true with substances too. So if you are a heavy drinker and you stop drinking for 3 months, then you start drinking again, you're going to quickly go back to your previous drinking levels without some kind of constraint. Excuse me. The habits are just too strong. They're going to pull you back into doing that. So I think that's one of the things that I kind of like, working with Cal Newport, for instance, in our Life in Focus course. One of the things that we talk about is the idea of contrasting, doing a declutter, which is where you sort of reduce your digital device usage for a month, and then you reevaluate what you want to reintegrate, with a detox where you just give it up for a month and then you go back to normal after. And I think for a dopamine detox, maybe you want to do the same thing, that maybe there's some activities in your life that, you like doing them too much and you do them too much. And so maybe either need to give them up entirely, or you need to only do them Sunday mornings or something, and the rest of the week I don't do it. And I think in those situations, you're trying to create kind of a stable habit pattern. I've been using this metaphor of this kind of water or ball rolling down a hill for motivation. And I think it's very important to realize that your habits are often defined what are the kind of adjacent opportunities for you. That if it's not simply the case that, like, out of all possible options in the universe, what's the most rewarding thing you could do right now? It's rather, given the context I'm in, given kind of what I typically do in these situations, what are the choices I have? And so if normal for you, you don't know why for you to do that when you're like contemplating, can reduce the kind of impulse to do those things. And I think if you continue from doing the hard work that you want to do, I think those are situations where you can reduce the kind of, if you just give up the thing entirely, then it's never going to be a context trigger after a little while, and it's going to be a lot easier to strive. So it just sort of depends on how much of a problem it is for you and how successful you can be at fencing it in. So let's go through another question here. How do you stay motivated when everyone around you is doing much better? I think this can be challenging. I think that we're naturally kind of animals of social comparison. So one of the pieces of research that I covered in the guide was on the big fish, little pond effect, which is basically that your self-concept, meaning how you view yourself, is not just determined by your absolute performance, but how you perform relative to other people. So if you are in, let's say, an elite class and you're a bright student, but you're not the best student, you may feel you're kind of mediocre. Whereas if you're the same person and you're in a weaker class, you may feel more motivated, or you may feel like you have a higher self-concept. And so I think that this can be kind of tricky, because I've definitely been in situations where I've kind of inadvertently placed myself in a more difficult group and then felt like I'm really bad, but it's not because I'm really bad at the thing in general. It's just because I'm with a group of people that are much better than me. So my best example of that is when I went to France to study French. I was put in a somewhat higher class level than I was in, and most of the other people had spent years studying French. I hadn't. And so I was the worst person in the class, and I felt like I was bad at French. I felt like I wasn't very good at it. And so I think what you want to do if you're in this situation where you feel like you're not as good as other people is to try to shift your focus onto something so that your attention is not so much on the social comparison, but maybe with yourself. So I think tracking your own progress is a good thing to do here, so that you're not focusing on how am I progressing compared to these other people, but how am I progressing compared to where I was a week ago or a month ago, or something like that. I think the other thing that can help is just to be kind of more explicit about it as well. You can also try to work on this in this way where you are connecting to, excuse me, I think we're having a little bit of a connection glitch right here. I think you can be a bit more explicit too about choosing a reference group that you fit into. So if you feel like the immediate class you're in is a little daunting, or you feel like you're not performing well, you can also look at a broader reference base, maybe one that will be a little bit more flattering to you. So someone is asking me, how do you get sort of long-term motivation? So you have some productivity for like 2 weeks, and then it drops off, and then you're no longer motivated. I think this is something that you want to account for in your projects. So I think that it's very natural to have a burst of enthusiasm. I think there's some evidence that when you are working on a goal, there's the desire to pursue it, but then in the act of pursuing it, you kind of act. And so when I plan goals, for instance, I try to accommodate for that. So some ways you can do that is, if it's a really long goal, you can break it into multiple parts, and each part will have kind of this to it, where you have like bursts of motivation in your time and enthusiasm. So when you start exercising, you might be really, really amped up and you're really, really good at doing it, but then just sort of recognizing, okay, yeah, but I'm not going to necessarily be this really, really amped up and you're really, really good at doing it. But then just sort of recognizing, okay, yeah, but I'm not going to necessarily be, how do I maintain that peak level of motivation for months and months and months? But how do I make the fact that I won't maintain the peak level of motivation? Put them in the chat and I will spend a few more minutes answering them. But I want to thank everyone for joining me here in this chat. I know that we had quite a few issues. This is my embarrassment every single day, and it works more or less. And then it's the first 2 streams that I'd set up. So hopefully we'll be able to do this again with fewer techs pushing through with me. So again, if you that you'd like me to discuss, don't hesitate to send me an email. So personal@scotthyoung.com. Happy to continue the discussion after this recording is finished. So thank you everyone for joining me.